The crimson sun painted the Pacific waters as Admiral Kiichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail with quiet confidence. Behind him stretched the most formidable naval armada Japan had ever assembled: 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 12 destroyers, all bearing down on a tiny speck of coral called Midway Atoll. For 6 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami, crushing everything in its path from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies. Nagumo's dark eyes reflected the same certainty that had driven his nation's warriors for generations. Failure was not a concept that existed in the Japanese military lexicon. It was an alien thought. As foreign as the Western ideals, they sought to purge from the Pacific. The rising sun had never set on Japanese ambitions, and today would be no different. Operation Me, the assault on Midway, would draw out the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet like a wounded animal from its den, allowing Admiral Yamamoto's superior forces to deliver the killing blow that would secure Japan's dominance forever. The morning briefing had proceeded with mechanical precision. Commander Mitsuo Fukita, the hero of Pearl Harbor, had outlined the attack plan with the same methodical confidence that had characterized every Japanese victory since the war began. 108 aircraft would launch at dawn, 30-6 Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, 36 Aichi Val dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters. They would reduce Midway's defenses to rubble, clearing the way for the invasion force that followed in their wake. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Ataya, leader of the fighter escort, had spoken of the enemy with barely concealed contempt. The Americans, he declared, were soft and undisciplined, their pilots lacking the spiritual fortitude and tactical superiority that came from serving the emperor. 6 months of unbroken victories had proven Japanese superiority beyond question. Why should today be any different? As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the flight deck, mechanics performed their final checks on the aircraft. Each Zero bore the blood-red Hinomaru on its wings, a symbol that had come to represent terror across the Pacific. The pilots, their faces serene beneath their leather-flying helmets, performed the traditional rituals before combat silent prayers to their ancestors, final letters home that they hoped would never be needed, in the quiet meditation that prepared the samurai spirit for battle. Nagumo checked his pocket watch, a gift from Emperor Hirohito himself, after the triumph at Pearl Harbor. In 1 hour, his aircraft would be airborne, carrying the might of the Empire toward another inevitable victory. The Americans at Midway possessed perhaps 40 aircraft, mostly obsolete fighters and bombers flown by inexperienced pilots. Against the cream of Japanese naval aviation, they would last minutes. Not ours. The admiral allowed himself a rare smile as he gazed toward the horizon where Midway lay sleeping, unaware of the storm approaching. By sunset, the atoll would fly. The rising sun flag and the path to Hawaii would lie open. The American Pacific Fleet, what little remained of it, would be forced into a final confrontation where Japanese superiority in ships, aircraft, and warrior spirit would settle the Pacific War once and for all. Failure simply wasn't possible. It never had been. 600 miles northeast of the Japanese fleet, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance stood in the flag plot of the USS Enterprise, studying intelligence reports that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. The soft glow of red battle lights illuminated his lean face as he absorbed information that promised to change everything. Thanks to the heroic work of cryptanalysts at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, the Americans knew exactly where Admiral Dade Nagumo's carriers would be when the sun rose over Midway. The intelligence breakthrough had come at enormous cost. For months, American codebreakers had worked around the clock to penetrate the Japanese Navy's JON-25 cipher, sacrificing sleep, health, and sanity in their underground bunker beneath Pearl Harbor, according to a classified report from the Office of Naval Intelligence that would later become public. Rochefort's team had achieved what many considered impossible. They had read Admiral Yamamoto's mail. Spruance's force was pitifully small compared to the Japanese armada bearing down on them. Task Force 16 consisted of the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, 6 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, Aboard the Yorktown, added one more carrier, 2 cruisers, and 5 destroyers. Against Nagumo's 4 fleet carriers and their escort of battleships and cruisers, the odds seemed insurmountable, but numbers told only part of the story. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the Enterprise's air group commander, had spent weeks drilling his pilots in the art of dive bombing, pushing obsolete Douglas Dauntless aircraft to their limits. The American pilots lacked the experience of their Japanese counterparts, but they possessed something else, a burning desire for revenge that had been growing since Pearl Harbor. On Midway itself, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Ira Kimes commanded a desperate collection of defenders that included obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, ancient Vought Vindicator dive bombers, and a handful of Army Air Force Boeing Flying Fortresses. His pilots were mostly fresh from flight school, many having never fired their guns in anger against the veteran air crews of the Japanese Navy. They would be lambs to the slaughter, or so it seemed. At precisely 4:30 in the morning, PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Ensign Jack Reed spotted the Japanese fleet approaching through the pre-dawn darkness. His radio crackled to life with words that would echo through history. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees. Distance 180 miles. As the sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had warned about was finally stirring, and its eyes were wide open. The first Japanese strike launched on schedule, their formation disappearing into the brightening sky like a dark cloud of vengeance. But this time, unlike every previous engagement, the Americans were waiting. Spruance had positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, perfectly placed to strike while Nagumo's aircraft were occupied with the atoll's defenses. As the sun climbed higher, painting the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson, both fleets moved toward a collision that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. The Japanese maintained their absolute confidence in victory. Failure remained unthinkable, a concept as foreign as defeat itself. But unknown to Admiral Nagumo, threading through the ocean toward his carriers, American torpedo and dive bomber squadrons were preparing to teach the Imperial Japanese Navy a lesson it had never learned, that even the mightiest warriors could fall when caught unprepared. The stage was set for the most decisive naval battle in Pacific history, where Japanese invincibility would meet American determination in a crucible of fire and steel. The first indication that something had gone terribly wrong came at 7:05. In the morning, when Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's voice crackled through the radio aboard the Akagi, his words, spoken in the clipped tones of a professional naval aviator, carried an undertone of surprise that sent a chill through the bridge. Enemy fighters rising to intercept. Midway's defenses are stronger than anticipated. Admiral Nagumo frowned as he listened to the increasingly urgent reports from his strike force. The Americans were fighting with unexpected ferocity, their obsolete aircraft diving into his formations with suicidal determination. Marine Captain Marion Carl, flying an ancient Brewster Buffalo, had already shot down 2 Zeros before his own aircraft was riddled with bullets. The attack on Midway was succeeding, but at a far higher cost than anyone had anticipated. At 7:45, Tomonaga delivered the message that would alter the course of the battle. Second strike necessary to neutralize Midway's defenses completely. The words hit Nagumo like a physical blow. In 6 months of warfare, Japanese airstrikes had never required follow-up attacks. The enemy had always crumbled before the superior skill and equipment of Imperial Navy pilots. Now, for the first time, American resistance was forcing tactical adjustments. The Admiral faced a crucial decision. His second strike force sat ready on the flight decks of all 4 carriers, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for the anticipated naval battle with the American fleet, converting them for aground. Attack mission would require at least an hour precious time that could prove costly if enemy ships appeared on the horizon. But Midway had to be neutralized before the invasion could proceed. "Begin rearming operations immediately," Nagumo ordered, his voice betraying none of the uncertainty that gnawed at his stomach. Across the 4 carriers,
a maintenance cruise
began the laborious process of replacing anti-ship weapons with high-explosive bombs designed for ground targets. The flight decks became scenes of controlled chaos as hundreds of men worked to reconfigure. The strike force, at 8:20, as if summoned by some malevolent spirit, the first American attack materialized out of the morning sky. 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers from the USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, came skimming across the waves at masthead height. Waldron's voice, transmitted in the clear over his radio, carried the grim determination of men who knew they were flying to their deaths. Attack immediately. We will get hits. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol fell upon Torpedo Squadron 8 like wolves on sheep. Zero fighters, flown by aces with dozens of kills to their credit, tore through the American formation with mechanical precision, one by one. The lumbering devastators tumbled into the sea, their crews becoming martyrs to American resolve. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 aircraft were destroyed, their wreckage scattered across miles of Pacific Ocean, but Waldron's sacrifice served a purpose beyond the tactical. His attack had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high altitude clear for what was coming next. At 9:25, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, spotted the Japanese fleet through a break in the clouds. The sight that greeted him would have filled lesser men with terror for massive aircraft carriers surrounded by a screen of warships, their decks crowded with aircraft being hastily rearmed and refueled. McCluskey's pilots had been searching for hours, their fuel gauges dropping toward empty, their hopes fading with each passing minute. Now, spread out below them, like pieces on a game board, lay the heart of Japanese naval power. The lieutenant commander's voice was calm as he gave the order that would change the war. This is it, boys. Pick your targets and make them count. The American dive bombers rolled into their attacks. Admiral Nagumo stood frozen on his bridge, watching aircraft plunge toward his carriers from 15,000 feet. For the first time in his naval career, he felt something he had never experienced. Before the cold touch of fear, the concept of failure, so long banished from Japanese military thinking, suddenly seemed terrifyingly real. The universe seemed to hold its breath as Lieutenant Dick Best pushed his Douglas Dauntless into a 70-degree dive, Yakagi growing larger in his bomb sight with each passing second. At 15,000 feet, the Japanese flagship had appeared as a mere toy ship on a painted ocean. Now, rushing toward him at terminal velocity, it filled his entire field of vision, a steel leviathan bristling with anti-aircraft guns that filled the sky with deadly blossoms of black smoke. Admiral Nagumo watched the American dive bombers plunge toward his fleet with the fascination of a man witnessing his own execution. The concept was so alien, so impossible that his mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. Japanese carriers were unsinkable. Japanese naval aviation was supreme. Japanese warriors were invincible. These were not beliefs, they were fundamental truths that had been proven in battle after battle across the Pacific. At 10:24 a.m., those truths died forever. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck the Akagi just aft of the bridge, punching through the flight deck and detonating among the aircraft being rearmed below. The explosion sent a geyser of flame and debris skyward, followed immediately by secondary blasts as aviation fuel ignited and torpedo warheads cooked off in the tremendous heat. Within seconds, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a floating inferno. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from the Yorktown were attacking the carrier Soryu. The ship's captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, stood on his bridge watching American aircraft dive through the curtain of anti-aircraft fire with the same methodical precision his own pilots had displayed at Pearl Harbor. 3 bombs struck his carrier in rapid succession, each one opening new wounds that fed the fires spreading through the ship's vitals. The third Japanese carrier, Kaga, suffered perhaps the most devastating attack of all. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, personally guided his aircraft into a screaming dive that ended with his bomb striking the carrier's forward elevator. The blast lifted the massive steel platform like a toy, flinging aircraft and men into the sea, while setting off a chain reaction of explosions that consumed the ship from bow to stern. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood transfixed as his fleet died around him. The roar of flames, the crash of secondary explosions, and the screams of wounded men created a symphony of destruction that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. Commander Minoto Genda, his brilliant air operations officer who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, appeared at his side with blood streaming from a head wound. Sir Genda shouted over the din of battle, "We must transfer your flag to another ship. The Akagi is finished." Finished. The concept was incomprehensible. Japanese ships didn't die, they were extensions of the Emperor's will, blessed by the gods themselves. Yet all around him, the evidence of mortality blazed with unquenchable fury. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, remained untouched for the moment, her aircraft launching a desperate counterstrike against the American fleet. But even as her planes disappeared into the morning sky, everyone aboard knew they were witnessing the end of an era. The myth of Japanese invincibility was burning alongside the three carriers that had carried the rising sun flag from triumph to triumph across the Pacific. Captain Diro Aoki of the Akagi made the decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. At 10:46 a.m., he gave the order to abandon ship, the first time in the war that a major Japanese warship had been surrendered to enemy action. As crew members streamed over the side into the oil-stained water, many wept openly, not from fear of death, but from the shame of defeat. The Japanese mind, conditioned by centuries of Bushido tradition to consider failure impossible, was experiencing its first taste of mortality. The divine wind that had always filled their sails was suddenly blowing from a different direction, carrying with it the bitter smoke of burning ships and shattered dreams. From the bridge of the Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, Admiral Tomoya Yamaguchi watched his three sister ships burn with the stoic composure of a samurai facing seppuku. Smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the tropical sky, black monuments to the death of an empire's dreams.
But
Yamaguchi was not ready to accept defeat. The son of a warrior family that traced its lineage back to the days of the shogun, possessed the kind of cold fury that made legends. "Prepare all available aircraft for immediate launch," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like a sword blade. "We will show these Americans what happens when they wound the dragon." Lieutenant Commander Michio Kobayashi, the Hiru's air group commander, bowed sharply and disappeared into the smoke-filled ready room, where his remaining pilots waited for orders. At 12:10 p.m., Aichi Val dive bombers and 60 fighters roared off the Hiryu's deck, climbing into the afternoon sun with vengeance burning in their hearts. Leading them was Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, one of Japan's most experienced dive bomber pilots, a man who had learned his deadly trade in the skies over China and perfected it at Pearl Harbor. Behind him flew the cream of Japanese naval aviation pilots, whose skill and dedication had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months. Their target was the USS Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher's flagship, steaming 25 miles to the northeast with her own aircraft returning from the morning's devastating attack. On the Japanese fleet, the American carrier had already proven her resilience, surviving bomb damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea, only to be rushed back into service through round-the-clock repairs at Pearl Harbor. Now she would face her greatest test. At 12:11 p.m., radar operators aboard the Yorktown detected the incoming Japanese strike. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, the ship's commanding officer, had been expecting this moment since the first reports of burning Japanese carriers reached his bridge. "General quarters," he announced over the ship's public address system. "All hands man your battle stations. This is not a drill. Yorktown's combat air patrol." 12 Grumman Wildcat fighters led by Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch climbed to intercept the Japanese formation. Thatch, inventor of the famous Thatch Weave fighter tactic, had been waiting months for a chance to test his theories against the vaunted Zero fighters. As the two formations closed at a combined speed of over 400 miles per hour, the sky above the Pacific became a three-dimensional chessboard, where death waited for the first player to make a mistake. The aerial battle that followed was a masterpiece of violence and skill. Zero fighters, flown by aces who had dominated Pacific skies for 6 months, twisted and turned through the tropical air in their deadly dance with American Wildcats. Lieutenant Commander Kobayashi, leading the Japanese dive bombers, pressed His attack with the single-minded determination of a man who knew his emperor was watching. 3 bombs struck the Yorktown in rapid succession. The first hit the flight deck near the island's superstructure, killing several men and starting fires that threatened the ship's nerve center. The second bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar bay, setting aircraft ablaze and filling the space with choking smoke. The third bomb struck aft, near the ship's vital engineering spaces, sending tremors through the steel hull that could be felt from bow to stern. But American damage control, perfected through hard experience in the early months of the war, proved superior to anything the Japanese had imagined possible. Within minutes, repair parties were flooding burning compartments, sealing damaged bulkheads, and restoring power to critical systems. Chief Warrant Officer John Garay, leading a damage control team into the smoke-filled hangar bay, embodied the stubborn American refusal to surrender that was becoming the hallmark of Pacific warfare. Admiral Yamaguchi, receiving reports of the successful attack on the Yorktown, allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. One American carrier burning was hardly compensation for the loss of 3 Japanese flat tops, but it was a beginning. At 2:30 p.m., he launched his second and final Strike 10 Kate torpedo bombers in 6 Zeros, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway. This time, the Americans were ready. The lessons learned in 6 months of desperate fighting were about to be tested in the crucible of aerial combat above the Pacific. The Japanese Empire was striking back with everything it had left, but the sleeping giant was fully awake now. Its fury was terrible to behold. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga guided his Kate torpedo bomber through the maze of anti-aircraft fire. Surrounding the Yorktown, his aircraft's engines streaming smoke from battle damage suffered during the morning raid on Midway. The veteran pilot, who had led attacks from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, knew this would be his final mission. His fuel tanks had been holed by American fighters, leaving him just enough aviation gasoline for one last attack. There would be no return to the Hiryu. The irony was not lost on him. For months, Japanese pilots had spoken of the glorious death that awaited true warriors in service to the emperor. Now, as black puffs of anti-aircraft fire burst around his aircraft like deadly flowers, Tominaga was about to discover whether those romantic notions matched the harsh reality of steel and flame. At 2:45 p.m., his torpedo struck the Yorktown's port side, explosion lifting the 20,000-ton carrier partially out of the water before dropping her back with a tremendous crash that could be heard for miles. The blast ruptured fuel lines, flooded engine rooms, and brought the great ship to a shuddering halt. Her flight deck canted at a dangerous angle as seawater poured through the gaping wound in her hull. Admiral Fletcher, forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Astoria as damage control parties fought to save his flagship, watched the Yorktown list further to port with each passing minute. For a moment, it seemed the Japanese had achieved their revenge. But American ingenuity, combined with the skill of damage control, expert Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich, performed what could only be described as a miracle. Within 2 hours, the Yorktown was steaming again, her flight deck leveled, her wounds temporarily patched with steel plates and determination. Smoke still rose from her superstructure, and her maximum speed was reduced to 20 knots, but she lived. Japanese pilots, returning from subsequent reconnaissance flights, reported in amazement that the sunk American carrier was not only afloat but launching aircraft. The resurrection of the Yorktown symbolized something larger, the transformation of American naval warfare from the peacetime mentality that had characterized the early months of the war into the hard-edged professionalism that would carry the Pacific Fleet to Tokyo Bay. Each battle, each loss, each moment of terror had taught valuable lessons that were now being applied with devastating effect. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamaguchi aboard the Hiryu faced the grim arithmetic of naval warfare. His air group had been decimated in the attacks on Midway and the Yorktown, leaving him with fewer than 20 operational aircraft. Against the combined air power of 3 American carriers for the damaged, Yorktown was still capable of launching strikes. His remaining pilots faced impossible odds. At 4:15 p.m., those odds caught up with him. 24 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, appeared overhead like avenging angels. Yamaguchi, standing on his bridge in full dress uniform, made no attempt to seek shelter as American bombs rained down on his ship. For direct hits transformed the Hiryu into the same kind of floating inferno that had consumed her sister ships earlier in the day, as flames engulfed the carrier's island superstructure. Yamaguchi faced the moment that Japanese naval doctrine had never seriously contemplated the complete destruction of a major fleet in a single day's fighting. The admiral, descendant of samurai warriors who had served the emperor for generations, made the decision that honor demanded he would go down with his ship, accepting responsibility for the catastrophe that had befallen the striking force. Captain Tomio Kaku, the Hiryu's commanding officer, joined his admiral on the bridge as their ship died around them. Together, they composed final messages to their families and the emperor, apologizing for their failure and requesting that their deaths serve as atonement for the defeat. As darkness fell over the Pacific, both men stood at attention on the blazing bridge, singing the Japanese national anthem as their ship settled deeper into the sea. The last of Admiral Nagumo's 4 fleet carriers disappeared beneath the waves at 9:10 p.m., taking with her the dreams of Japanese empire in the Pacific. For the first time since the war began, Japanese minds were forced to confront the unthinkable reality of total defeat, and the taste was more bitter than death itself. The sun rose on June 5, 1942, over a Pacific Ocean littered with the debris of Japanese ambitions. For aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Harale on the ocean floor, taking with them over 300 aircraft and many of Japan's most experienced pilots, the cream of imperial naval aviation, the men who had terrorized the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, now rested in steel tombs 2 miles beneath the surface. Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, rescued from the burning Akagi by destroyer crews, stood on the bridge of the cruiser Nagara, watching the oil slicks that marked his fleet's grave. His weathered face, which had radiated confidence just 24 hours earlier, now bore the haggard look of a man who had witnessed the impossible. The invincible striking force, Japan's spear, thrust into the heart of American power, had been shattered in a single day of fighting back in Tokyo. The first fragmentary reports of the disaster reached Imperial Navy headquarters as staff officers were planning victory celebrations. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, read the radio messages with growing disbelief. For carriers sunk? Impossible. The reports must be exaggerated, the result of battle confusion and poor communications. Japanese carriers didn't sink. They were extensions of divine will, blessed by the gods themselves. But as hour followed hour, more detailed damage reports arrived via radio. The magnitude of the catastrophe became undeniable. Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's greatest naval strategist, sat in his cabin aboard the battleship Yamato as the truth settled over him like a burial shroud. The war he had hoped to end with a single decisive blow had instead entered a new phase, one where Japanese victory was no longer inevitable. The psychological impact of Midway rippled through Japanese society like an earthquake. For generations, the concept of failure had been systematically eliminated from military thinking. Bushido, the way of the warrior, demanded victory or death. There was no middle ground, no accommodation for defeat. Now, suddenly, the nation was forced to confront the reality that their military machine was not invincible. Their pilots were not superhuman. Their cause was not blessed by the gods. Emperor Hirohito, informed of the defeat in his private study within the imperial palace, received the news with the stoic composure expected of a divine ruler. But those close to him noted the way his hands trembled as he read the casualty reports. The first visible crack in the imperial facade that had sustained Japanese morale through 6 months of seemingly effortless conquest. The strategic implications were even more devastating than the immediate losses. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been crippled, possibly permanently. The trained pilots lost at Midway represented years of preparation that could not be quickly replaced. The carriers themselves, products of years of construction and national treasure, lay beyond any hope of salvage or repair. American intelligence. Monitoring Japanese radio communications in the days following the battle, detected something they had never heard before in enemy transmissions: uncertainty. The clipped, confident tone that had characterized Japanese military communications since Pearl Harbor was replaced by hesitation, by requests for confirmation, by the subtle linguistic markers of doubt that trained listeners could recognize. Perhaps, most significantly, the battle marked the moment when American naval aviation came of age. The pilots who had stumbled through the early months of the war, learning harsh lessons at places like Wake Island and the Java Sea, had evolved into a fighting force capable of matching and defeating the best Japan could offer. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had warned about was not only awake, it was learning to fight with the same methodical precision that had characterized Japanese expansion as rescue ships plucked survivors from life rafts scattered across hundreds of square miles of Pacific Ocean. Both sides understood that everything had changed. The war that had begun with Japanese aircraft over Pearl Harbor would continue, but now the initiative belonged to America. The concept of failure, so long banished from Japanese military thinking, had returned with a vengeance. Carried on the wings of American dive bombers that had taught the Empire a lesson it would never forget. The Battle of Midway was over. Its echoes would reverberate through the remainder of the Pacific War. A constant reminder that even the most carefully laid plans could be undone by courage, determination, and the simple refusal to accept defeat. Japanese minds, which had never considered failure possible, would spend the next 3 years learning to live with its bitter reality.